It was about 12 or 13 years ago. My mother-in-law came to church with my wife and me. The electric power in our area had gone out, and it had been cut off because of a widespread ice storm. And we lived about a mile and a half away, and we have a wood stove and kerosene lamps, so we had light and heat. So my mother-in-law came to stay with us for 8 days. Well, if you can count like I can, you can't go 8 days without having a Sabbath coming in. And things were fine up here in this area, so out of curiosity, my mother-in-law rode along with us to do our church service that Sabbath. And during the course of the church service, one of our congregational hymns was number 175, Onward, Christian Soldiers. And the last line of the chorus in our hymnal was changed from the original lyrics that the songwriter had written. The original lyrics read, "With the cross of Jesus going on before." But when we sing it and we look in our hymnal, the lyrics read, "With the word of Jesus going on before." Well, if you grew up singing in a Onward Christian Soldiers in a Protestant church, you were probably used to singing the original version, with the cross of Jesus, instead of the UCG version, with the word of Jesus. Well, my mother-in-law wasn't the only person who struggled with that change in lyrics, from changing the word cross to the changed word to the word. Other visitors over the years have questioned the change in lyrics as well. Well, how would you respond to a person who's new in the faith when they ask about not using the word or using crosses? Perhaps you've been given a gift by someone who knew that you were a Christian, and the gift, they meant well, but it was engraved, perhaps it was marked, printed, or embroidered with the sign of the cross. And we do see crosses everywhere. They're on earrings, they're on necklaces, cufflinks, bumper stickers. They're on Protestant and Roman Catholic church buildings. They're embossed into Bible covers. They're embroidered into clothing, and you see a lot of them on tombstones in cemeteries. Indeed, if you travel to Europe and you visit the ancient or medieval castles, you'll see crosses on many items from the Middle Ages. You'll see them on swords, on shields, on flags, and on banners. And even today, there are national flags that bear the sign of the cross. Quickly coming to mind are Norway and Sweden, Switzerland, and even Great Britain. It was many years ago. I was courting my wife, and I'd flown here from out of state to visit my wife, and her siblings were all there at the same time. Her parents were both alive and at her house, and I was staying at a young church couple's place while I was visiting. Well, I was at the house, and I have an uncle who's able to travel, and he knew I was going to be in Arkansas, so he thought he would interpose himself and visit my future bride. And he comes to the door, unbeknownst to any of us. And he comes to the door. Now her family's all around the dining room table. I've been a little jet lagged, so I'm lying on the couch in the living room. And at the door, there's a knock on the door, and this tall Viking-looking man is at the door, and he's got a dark suit on. He's got a priest's collar on, reverse collar. He's got this huge Bible, never seen one quite that big, and then this large cross on a necklace hanging around his neck. Now, the man's an agnostic at best. An atheist is probably the best way you could refer to that. And he comes to the door and proclaimed that he had come to save their souls. And from the other room, I could tell who the voice was. And I says, "Is that Uncle Bud?" Oh, who could believe it that he came from Florida just to try to embarrass me or make a scene. Interesting fellow, delightful man. He's been actually quite helpful over the years, even helpful to the church, much to his chagrin, if he ever knew. But the question here for today is, then, what do we do with this use of the word cross or the symbol cross or this lyric cross, where this has been generally connected with Christianity? Well, what should we do? In 1 Peter 3:15, we read, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you for a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. So we have this responsibility that if somebody is going to put something on us, let's know why we believe or think the way we do. There's a UCG, has a United Church of God, has a short article under their Bible study section. Why shouldn't we wear a cross as a sign of being a Christian? It was written in 2010. And they ask this question: is there a biblically sound reason not to? And if we go through the article, it's really pointing out that a Christian's behavior is really by their actions. It must be known by their actions and not by some artificial device. So the question we then ask is, who was it that decided in the first place that the cross was a sign of Christianity? Well, because it doesn't come out of the Bible. We don't read that, honor the cross, put a cross on things to identify them, and so forth. And it doesn't come from the practices of the New Testament church. Well, there are many different kinds of crosses. And of course, if you take a look at the references, and there's 28 references to cross in the Bible, and so I pulled it up on Strong's Concordance. And the definition, the most common biblical use of cross is a well-known instrument of most cruel and ignominious punishment. Borrowed by the Greeks and Romans from the Phoenicians and to it were affixed among the Romans down to the time of Constantine the Great, the guiltiest of criminals, particularly the basest of slaves, robbers, authors and abettors of insurrections, and occasionally in the provinces at the arbitrary pleasure of the governors. Also, and it's called an upright stake, a pointed one, such as used in fences or palisades. Well, I was a farm boy. I did a lot of fencing. And so we know what an upright stake is. It's a pole. It's like a sharpened pencil on one end. And that stake, and now we had softer ground on the farm, not the hard ground and rocky soil that we may have here in Arkansas, but in Minnesota, thick, deep, rich soil. And we would hold the pole or the post, usually a cedar post or a pine post, sharpened on one end, flat on the top. Somebody would hold the post, somebody would swing the hammer, and the post would go into the ground. Reminds me of my dad told me about the neighbor when he explained why he had a withered hand. And he said, well, he and his hired man were holding the post, pound, pound, pound. And finally, when it was in the ground, the owner says, yep, that's good enough. And he put his hand down on the top of the post, and the hired man was still in mid-swing and crushed the hand. So I'm thinking post and pointed post. I can't help but think of the neighbor with the withered hand. This upright stake, especially a pointed one. It's also true if we read this in other versions or in other concordances. But they also take a look at the equivalent. They use it in the metaphorical sense of the equivalent to the crucifixion which Christ underwent. So it's this pointed post or a stake. But there's no indication in the direction that is as cross members. However, that's not the only place to look. If you take a look, and I pulled up and so I went to a Roman Catholic website, francismary.org, and they had this article about, is the sign of the cross unbiblical? And they were going through their exposition as to why it was just fine. Not only fine, it was a good thing. And they were going through it. Well, this is interesting to read. But it's interesting, they never went through the definition of the word that Strong's did, the staros word, that is frequently translated as cross. But the translation did not occur until the 1611 version of the King James Bible to come out in the word cross. So by that time, it had been established since roughly 300 to 312 by Constantine the Great, and thereafter to establish the cross. So by then they were used to this cross. So when they translated the Bible, they tended to look to that translation by making up their own. Interesting that it says, and we'll come back to this later, on this on the Roman Catholic website, it says, "For one thing is for sure, there's no Bible verse that prohibits the use of the sign of the cross." So we're going to find out if that's so. Under BibleStudy.org, they say, is wearing the cross wrong and an idolatry? Well, let's take a look then at, and if we already looked at it, it's a place at which people are crucified. And this, in Strong's defines this word stauros as an instrument of punishment, and that people had, if an upright stake, to nail people to it. The hands and the feet were nailed. So if we take a look then at Luke 24, you can see how that was occurring and how that would cause somebody to die if there were hands nailed above the person as well as the feet nailed to this stake below the person. If we look at Luke 24, starting in verse 36, and I'll get there. Because after Christ was resurrected and he appeared to his disciples. Now, as they said these things, Jesus himself stood in the midst of them and said, "Peace to you." But they were terrified and frightened and supposed they had seen a spirit. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? Behold my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see I have." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And what do we say? But while they still did not believe for joy, that was so hard to comprehend. They saw somebody die, and they knew the hands and feet were nailed to this stake, and it was too hard for them to believe. What did they marveled? He said to them, "Have you got any food here?" It's probably been a while since he had eaten. And so they gave him a piece of broiled fish, honeycomb, and he took and ate it in their presence. So you have this, he's manifesting himself now as he were in regular human life before as he appeared to them. The hands and the feet were nailed to that, and so the evidence was, see, here's the holes that were there. Now, if you nail somebody's hands to it, of course it's going to be over that. That means the weight is going to cause somebody to suffocate normally at that time. But the representation of a cross takes a number of different shapes. One place said 7 different shapes of a cross. Another one says 5 different shapes, and they were showing representative samples of it. And some have an Egyptian symbol of the letter T with a circle on the top of it, and representing what we call the Tau, and represented a female. And that was used by a number of pagan religions to represent their female goddesses, such as Venus or Astarte. Constantine the Great in 313 A.D. Was said to have stated that Catholics believed the symbol was a great charm and they would adore the cross as much as God himself. And that was in the reference work of The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop in chapter 5. And he writes, the cross is looked upon as the grand charm, as the great refuge in every season of danger, in every hour of temptation, as the infallible preservative from all the powers of darkness. Yet that was long pre-existing the time of Christ, and really has nothing to do with Christ or the Christianity. And of course, we all have a pretty good grip on what the 10 Commandments say, and we're told, don't make idols, things that are created to worship like God or to help us worship the true God. So If then a person would wear a cross or use that cross in their worshiping process, that would be dangerously close to idolatry. And while some people will then say, well, it's representing a taking away of sins, it's reasonable to say, shouldn't you perhaps hate that symbol, which is a symbol of the torture that the Romans put the Savior through, rather than venerating it? So we have this mixed history of the cross. We do see it, the cross, everywhere. I mean, once you start looking for it, it shows up. You can see it on television as representing what people think Christianity is about. Some sports players put it on their shoes, or the football players will put it on their cheeks. You find this really quite a variety of places where you're going to put. The CatholicStraightAnswers.com says the sign of the cross is a beautiful gesture which reminds the faithful of both the cross of salvation while invoking the Holy Trinity. Now we're getting a little closer to it, because a stake is simply a vertical pointed post, but the Trinity would have 3 tops to it. And so the article here from the Roman Catholic website is that it's important to have the 3 tops to the cross. So you have both sides, and the top as representing the Trinity. And of course, the Trinity is never mentioned in the Bible. But according to the Catholic website, about the 9th century, the sign of the cross was incorporated into their Mass or their church service, along with the signing of making the sign of the cross from the forehead, the lips, and the heart, and passing along a blessing. And then they went from forehead to chest to the right shoulder and the left shoulder, because they wanted to symbolize the Holy Trinity. So you see, making the sign of the cross was important to them to symbolize the Trinity. But of course, we know the Bible does not support the idea of a Trinity. It's not a closed Godhead. And that would be against what God is attempting to do, which is to enlarge and expand his family. And so to have then something that adds to the worship that would take us away from worshiping the true God would in fact then be contra-biblical. If you take a look at the cross that they're commonly using, the T-shaped cross, the 3-top cross, they call it the cross of Tau or Tau cross. It's named for the Greek letter T. Has been first used in Christianity, but it goes back to the Egyptians and maybe earlier. And for the long history, the Tau cross was a symbol of the Roman god Mithras and the Greek god Attis. It was even in Norwegian mythology that the hammer of Thor was seen as a Tau cross. The bull, as an astrological sign of the Taurus, gets his name from that same Tau, and Ru, which is an oval that is topped onto the cross. And so it was used by the Druids in the British Isles when venerating trees by scrawling that symbol into the bark of their sacred trees. So this symbol of the cross is really contrary to what God expects of us. And all it takes is a little bit of research. It doesn't take a lot. But by looking through that level of research, we can understand what God expects of us is to live a good life and to avoid trying to do what we call syncretism, adopting the practices of the world into the church and then trying to call it holy. We turn to Deuteronomy 12, verses 29 through 32. In Deuteronomy 12, verses 29 through 32. Today we heard a number of references in Deuteronomy, and the speaker beat all around the bush for what I was going to quote today. But it's really prophetic in this sense, in Deuteronomy 12. And this is when the Israelites were ready to go into the promised land, and God gave them warnings and said, when this is where you're going to go, here's what you have to be careful of. In Deuteronomy 12, starting in verse 29, the Lord your God will cut off before you the nations you're about to invade and dispossess. In other words, he's going to separate them from you. But when you have driven them out and settled in their land, and after they have been destroyed before you, be careful not to be ensnared by inquiring about their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods? We will do the same. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because when worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods. Verse 32, see that you do all I command you. Do not add to it or take away from it. So when we see the symbol of the cross, understand that this is not something that we adopt into our lives. Understand where it came from, the origins of it, or long before Jesus Christ, and understand that our true symbol of Christianity is what we do.